He was not a man who talked much about himself. That was the first thing people noticed about Silas Brennan, and usually the last. He was 51 years old, and he moved through the world the way a man moves when he has already decided he doesn't need much from it. He ran a small cattle operation outside of Pincher Creek, Alberta. Nothing grand, nothing that would make the papers, just 340 acres of short grass prairie that he had bought piece by piece over 23 years, and a modest two-story house that still had his late mother's curtains in the kitchen windows because he had never thought to change them. The curtains were pale yellow. They had faded to something closer to white. He left them. That was the kind of man Silas was. He drove into town on the second Friday of every month for supplies, stopped at the same hardware store, the same feed supply, ate lunch at a diner on Main Street where the waitress already knew to bring him black coffee before he sat down. He tipped well. He said thank you. He did not linger. People in Pincher Creek respected him the way people respect a fence post. It's always there, it holds, you never think about it until you need it. The morning everything changed, he was loading a bag of fence posts into the bed of his truck. He heard it before he saw it. A raised voice, a man's voice, not arguing, commanding. The kind of voice that doesn't expect to be questioned, and gets very ugly when it is. Silas set down the post slowly. He looked across the street. In the narrow alley beside the grain merchant's office, a man in a pressed town coat had a young woman by the wrist. She was pulling back. He was not letting go. Around them, two other men stood with their hands in their pockets, watching the way people watch when they've decided the scene isn't their business. The young woman said something Silas couldn't hear. The man in the coat laughed and said something back. Then he raised his free hand. Silas was already crossing the street. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided something and does not need to announce it. He stepped into the alley. He put himself between the man in the coat and the young woman, close enough that the man would have to go through him to reach her. "I think," Silas said quietly, "she'd like her wrist back." Was Petra Calloway, and she was 26 years old. She had come up from Lethbridge 8 months earlier to take a bookkeeping position at the grain merchant's office, a job she had applied for twice before the office manager, a practical woman named Mrs. Hyslop, finally hired her. She was good with numbers, better than the man who had the job before her, better than most people realized, because Petra had learned early that being obviously capable in the wrong room made people uncomfortable. So she had developed a talent for being quietly excellent, which is a talent that looks a lot like modesty, but is actually a form of self-preservation. The man in the town coat was Oliver Skane. He was 38 years old, the son of the wealthiest grain broker in the Crow's Nest region, and he had decided 6 weeks after Petra arrived in Pincher Creek that she was going to marry him. He had made this decision the way he made all decisions, alone, without consulting the other party, and with absolute confidence that the outcome was already settled. Petra had said no the first time politely. She had said no the second time firmly. She had said no the third time with her office door closed, and her voice raised just enough to make Mrs. Hyslop look up from her ledger in the next room. Oliver Skane did not hear the word no the way other people heard it. He heard it the way certain men hear a door that isn't locked yet as an inconvenience, not a boundary. That morning, he had been waiting outside the grain merchant's office when Petra came out to bring a letter to the post. He had put his hand on her wrist before she got to the end of the alley. He had told her that she was being foolish, that she didn't understand what she was refusing, that a girl in her position with no family in the area and a rented room above a laundry should understand that a man like him did not come along twice. Petra had said, very clearly, "Let go of me." He had raised his hand, and then there was a man standing between them, a tall, quiet man with calloused hands and a jacket that had seen better decades, who said, "I think she'd like her wrist back," in a voice that was not loud and was not warm and left absolutely no room for interpretation. Oliver Skane looked at him. He took stock of what he saw: the weathered face, the working man's clothes, the complete absence of anything performative about the way the stranger was standing, and he made a mistake that men like him often make. He decided this person was beneath him. "This isn't your concern," Oliver said. "No," Silas agreed. It wasn't. That single word, "wasn't," hung in the air between them. One of Oliver's companions shifted his weight. The other looked away. Oliver Skane looked at Silas Brennan for another moment, and then, calculating, the way a man does when he is more interested in winning the next thing than this thing, he released Petra's wrist, smoothed the front of his coat, and walked out of the alley. His companions followed without speaking. Silas turned to Petra. She was holding her wrist with her other hand, not because it was badly hurt. It wasn't, not yet. But the way you hold a part of yourself after someone has grabbed it without permission, the way you check that it still belongs to you. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked up at him. She was trying to decide, he could tell, whether she needed to say she was fine, which was what the situation seemed to expect of her, or whether she could simply tell the truth. "Not entirely," she said, "but I will be." Silas nodded. He didn't press. He didn't offer a speech. He looked at her wrist and said, "Do you have someone here? Someone you can tell about this?" "Mrs. Hyslop," Petra said. "She's inside." "All right." He stepped back to give her room. "You should tell her. Today, not later." She had a sharp face, not harsh, but alert, the kind of face that noticed things and remembered them. She said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Silas said. He picked up his jacket from where he'd set it on a crate and turned back toward the street. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "What's your name?" He told her. She told him hers. And that was how it started. Not with anything grand. Not with any moment that a person could point to later and say, "There," that was the beginning. But with two names exchanged in a narrow alley in Pincher Creek on an ordinary Friday morning in October, while the wind came down off the Rockies and rattled the sign above the grain merchant's door. He did not think about her on the drive home. That is what he told himself, and he believed it, mostly, because Silas Brennan was a man who had long since learned to distrust the things he hoped for. He was 51 years old. He had been engaged once, 20 years ago, to a woman named Claire who had decided, 3 months before the wedding, that she didn't want the life that came with him, the remoteness, the work, the specific kind of loneliness that belongs to places where there are more cattle than people. Claire had been right to leave. He had understood that eventually. But understanding something and being changed by it are not the same thing. And Silas had been changed in the particular way that makes a person careful, careful with hope, careful with wanting, careful about letting himself believe that things might go differently this time. So he did not think about Petra Calloway on the drive home. He thought about the fence posts he'd bought and the section of fence line that needed repair on the north pasture, and the price of feed this winter, and the way the light was sitting on the foothills to the west, which was the kind of thing he noticed even when he was trying not to notice anything beautiful. He went back to town 3 weeks later for supplies. On a Tuesday, which was unusual, he told himself it was because he needed a part for the water pump. This was true. It was also not the only reason. He stopped in at the grain merchant's office to ask about winter pricing. He did not need to do this. He had always done his grain business in the spring. He did it anyway. Petra was at the front desk. She was working through a column of figures with a pencil, and she didn't look up immediately, and when she did, something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise, not quite relief, but something in the territory between them. "Mr. Brennan," she said. "Miss Calloway." He took off his hat. "How have you been?" "Better," she said, and then, after a pause, "He came back 2 weeks ago, to the office." Silas went still. "Mrs. Hyslop called the constable," Petra said. "Oliver left." "I don't think he'll come back again." She said it steadily, but he could hear in her voice the particular steadiness of someone who has had to be steady more than they should have to be. "I wanted you to know, in case you'd been wondering." "I had been," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the October wind pushed a scrap of paper down the middle of Main Street. "I close at 5, Petra said. "There's a diner 2 doors down that does a decent chop." Silas put his hat back on. "I know the one," he said. "I'll be out front at 5. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment. Friends, if you've been listening from the beginning, maybe you're out there in Manitoba, or up in the Yukon, or somewhere in Nova Scotia where the nights are coming in colder now, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop it in the comments. Tell me your province, your city, your little town. I read every one of them. And if this story is sitting with you the way it's sitting with me, go ahead and leave a like. It lets me know to keep going, and that means more than you know. Now, back to Silas and Petra. They had dinner that evening, and then again 2 weeks later, and then, in the quiet, practical way of 2 people who are old enough to know what matters and young enough to still be surprised by it. It became a regular thing. Fridays, when Silas came into town. Sometimes Tuesdays. Once, on a Sunday afternoon in November, he drove out to the edge of town and parked the truck on a rise above the valley, and they sat watching the Rockies go pink, and then purple, and then dark, and Petra pulled her coat tighter and said, "How long have you been out here?" 23 years, Silas said. "Do you ever want to leave?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "Do you?" Petra was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I did. When I was younger, I thought the right life was always somewhere you weren't." She looked at the mountains. "I'm not sure I think that anymore." They sat in comfortable silence. That was the thing Silas noticed, and kept noticing, about Petra Calloway. She was not a person who filled silence with noise. She let it be what it was. That was rarer than people realized. He was 51 and she was 26. And he thought about that gap the way he thought about the gap between his north pasture and his south pasture. It was real, it was there, it had to be accounted for. But it did not make the land less good on either side. He had not said any of this to her. He wasn't sure yet if he had the right to. What he had done was listen. When she told him about Lethbridge, about the father who left when she was 9, the mother who worked 2 jobs and didn't always come home in the same condition she left, the 2 years of accounting school that she had paid for entirely herself. He listened without offering solutions or sympathy that would have felt like reduction. When she talked about Oliver Skane, about how it had felt to have a man decide her life for her, to treat her refusal as a temporary obstacle rather than a final answer, he listened to that too. He did not make it small. He did not tell her it was over now. "What did it feel like," she asked once, "when you stood between him and me, in the alley?" Silas thought about it. "It felt like the only thing to do," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." He looked at his coffee. "It felt right. The way a fence line feels right when you've put it where it belongs. You just know." Petra looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I don't know what to do with you, Silas Brennan." "You don't have to do anything with me," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." The winter came hard that year, the way Alberta winters come hard. Without apology, without warning, in the particular way that the prairies have of reminding you that you are small and the land is not. Silas's water pump failed in January. He fixed it himself, in -28, working by lantern light in the pump house for 4 hours until his hands were so cold he could barely close them. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask for help. That was not stubbornness. It was just the way he had always lived, the way a man lives when he has built something alone over 20 years and has learned that the waiting for help can cost you more than the doing of the thing. Petra found out about it 3 days later when she saw the state of his hands across a dinner table. "Your pump," she said. "Fixed," he said. "Those are frostbite burns on your fingers. They're healing." She put down her fork. She looked at him with the particular expression she had, not angry exactly, but alert in the way of someone who has decided to say the thing instead of letting it sit. "You could have called me," she said. "I didn't need help." "That's not why you call someone," Petra said. "You call someone because you don't want to be alone in it. There's a difference." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He was 51 years old, and no one had said that to him in a very long time, possibly ever. He had built his whole life around the assumption that needing things was a burden, that wanting company was a weakness, that the correct posture for a man in his position was self-sufficiency, which is an admirable quality and also, taken too far, a very effective way to make sure nothing can reach you. "You're right," he said. Petra picked up her fork. "I know," she said, "and then, because she was Petra, I usually am." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not polite, the kind that catches a man by surprise. She watched him laugh, and there was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, something careful and warm at the same time. In February, Oliver Skane's lawyer sent a letter to the grain merchant's office. It was not threatening, exactly. It was the kind of letter that costs a great deal of money to write and is very careful not to say anything that could be held against the person who sent it, while making absolutely clear what they mean. It suggested that Petra's continued employment in the Pincher Creek area might not be in her best interests. It used phrases like professional reputation and ongoing complications and mutual benefit of all parties. Petra brought the letter to Silas on a Tuesday evening. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. She had been to his house twice now, and she always took the same chair, the one that faced the window with his mother's pale curtains, and she set the letter down between them. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to go to work tomorrow and the day after and the day after that." She looked at him steadily. "What I need to know is whether you're worried about being attached to this, to me. Because I understand if you are. Oliver Skane has a long reach in this region, and you've got a business here, and I won't." "Petra," Silas said, "let me finish. I won't have anyone lose something because of me. That's not who I am." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He was 51 years old, and he had been careful for 20 years, and he was looking at a 26-year-old woman who had driven to his house in a February blizzard to give him a choice. And the thing that moved him most was not the letter or the threat, but the fact that she had thought of him first, before herself, and had come here not to ask for help, but to make sure he wasn't getting hurt by association. "I've been running cattle on this land for 23 years, he said. "I've seen 3 boom cycles, 2 droughts, 1 flood, and a hailstorm that took out my entire north crop in 40 minutes. I am not afraid of Oliver Skane's lawyer." Petra looked at him. "And furthermore," he said, which was a word he almost never used, "I'd like you to stop talking about being attached to you as if it were a liability. It is not a liability. I find it to be." He stopped. He looked at the table. Something else entirely. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was moving across the prairie in long, low waves, the way it does in February when there is nothing between you and the mountains but distance. "Silas," Petra said. Her voice was different now. "What is it you're trying to say?" He looked up at her. He was a man who was not good at the saying of things. He knew this about himself. He had always known it. He was good at the doing, at showing up, at fixing, at standing between people and the things that were coming for them, but the words were harder. The words required a kind of vulnerability that he had learned, over 51 years, to be very careful about. But she was sitting across from him at his kitchen table in his mother's old curtain light in February, and she had just told him she was worried about his business and his livelihood before she thought about her own situation, and he thought, "This is a person worth getting it wrong for." "I think," he said slowly, "that I'd like you to stay, not just in Pincher Creek, here." He looked at the window. If that's something you'd want, eventually. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm 51 years old, and I know that's—" "Stop," Petra said. He stopped. "Don't apologize for your age," she said. "I'm not 26 years old and confused about what I feel. I know the difference between a man who sees me and a man who wants to own me. I've met both." She reached across the table and put her hand over his frost-burned fingers very gently. "I'd like to stay," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. Outside, the Alberta winter went on being what it was, cold and wide and indifferent to the small warmths of human life. But in that kitchen, with the pale curtains that had once belonged to a woman he had loved and lost, something quiet settled into place. Like a fence line that has finally been put where it belongs. People in Pincher Creek talked, of course. People always talk. They said Petra was too young for him. They said she was after the land. They said Silas Brennan had lost his mind in his old age, which was a curious thing to say about a man of 51 who had, by any reasonable measure, more clarity in that year than he'd had in the previous 10 put together. A woman at the hardware store asked Petra, with the particular smile of someone who has wrapped a sharp thing in a pleasant expression, whether she had thought about what she was getting into. Petra said mildly, "I have. Have you thought about what you're getting out of?" The woman at the hardware store did not ask again. Oliver Skane sent one more letter. In March, Silas drove to the lawyer's office in Fort Macleod, a 40-minute drive, which he made at 7 in the morning without telling anyone, and had a conversation with Oliver's lawyer that was described afterward as quiet and brief and very clear. He drove back to Pincher Creek in time for lunch. He did not tell Petra about the drive. She found out from Mrs. Constable, who had heard from the lawyer's receptionist, who had heard from the lawyer's Mrs. "You drove to Fort Macleod," Petra said. "Needed to have a conversation," Silas said. "Alone." "Yes." She looked at him. "I thought we talked about calling someone. That wasn't." He started again. "That was something I needed to do myself." Petra considered him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Was it effective?" "I believe so." "Then I won't argue." She paused. "Next time, tell me first." "Next time," Silas said, "I will." And that was how they argued. Not with raised voices or theatrics, but with honesty, and the willingness to be told when they were wrong, and the understanding that the goal was not to win, but to get it right. That kind of arguing takes practice. Neither of them had had much of it before. They were learning. The spring came the way spring always comes to southern Alberta, late, sudden, and with a specific kind of beauty that people who have survived the winter feel they have personally earned. The crocuses came up in the foothills. The creek behind Silas's north pasture ran clear and fast with snowmelt. The cattle moved differently in spring, looser, lighter, something almost like happiness in the way they grazed. On a Saturday in April, Petra drove out to the ranch without calling ahead. She was 26 years old, and she had been in Pincher Creek for 14 months, and she had, over those months, made a life. Not a temporary life, not a life in waiting, a real one. She knew the names of the cattle. She knew which section of fence needed repair. She knew that Silas drank his coffee black in the morning and with a small amount of cream in the evening, a distinction that he had never mentioned and probably didn't realize he made. She found him in the north pasture, replacing a section of fence line that the winter had damaged. He worked with the slow, careful efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times and did not need to hurry. She watched him for a moment before he heard her. He turned. He saw her. He set down the post driver. "You should have called," he said. "I would come back to the house." "I know," Petra said. "I wanted to see you working." "Why?" She walked toward him through the new grass. "Because this is who you are," she said simply. "This land, this work, this, all of it. I wanted to see it, so I could know I love the whole thing, not just the parts that are easy." Silas Brennan was 51 years old, and he had spent 23 years on this land, and no one had ever said anything quite like that to him. He had thought, somewhere in the back of his careful mind, that the land was the thing that would always come between him and anyone who might want to be close to him. That the work, the isolation, the particular demands of a cattle operation in southern Alberta were the reasons Claire had left and the reasons he had stopped trying. He had not understood, until this moment, that for the right person, none of that was an obstacle. It was simply part of what there was to love. He walked to her across the new spring grass. He took her hand, the wrist that had once been held by a man who didn't understand the word no, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to itself and is only on loan to you. "I love you," he said. "I should have said that in February." "You said enough in February," Petra told him. "You said you wanted me to stay. That's not the same thing." "Close enough," she said, "for a man who doesn't talk much." He looked at her. The foothills were green behind her, and the mountains were still white, and the creek was running, and somewhere in the south pasture one of the cattle was making a low sound like a complaint about the morning. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly itself. "Will you marry me?" he said. It wasn't quite a question, but it wasn't quite not either. It was the way Silas said things, direct, a little rough at the edges, entirely sincere. Petra looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "on one condition. Name it." "Those curtains in the kitchen. We keep them." He looked at her. He thought of the pale yellow curtains, faded now to something close to white, that had hung in his mother's kitchen window for 30 years and had stayed there through everything. He had never been able to explain, even to himself, why he hadn't replaced them. "Done," he said. She laughed. He held her hand. 51 and 26, on a cold April morning in Alberta, with the mountains behind them and the whole long season of work ahead. It was not a perfect story. But the best ones never are. The best ones have fence posts and frost-burned fingers and letters from lawyers and women who say what they mean, and men who drive 40 minutes before breakfast to stand up for the people they love without telling anyone about it. The best ones have silences that mean more than speeches, and curtains that stay up because some things should be kept even when you can't explain why. Friends, we've come a long way together tonight. Wherever you are out there, listening from your kitchen in Prince Edward Island, or sitting up late in a farmhouse in Saskatchewan, or maybe you're somewhere in British Columbia with the rain on the window, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving this story your time. Silas Brennan was 51 years old, and he had learned, the hard way, that the strongest thing a man can do is not the loudest thing. And Petra Calloway was 26, and she knew what she knew, and she did not apologize for knowing it. Between the two of them, they made something that neither one could have made alone. That's the only kind of love worth a story about. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if this one found you on a hard night, or a quiet one, or somewhere in between. I read every word. Until next time, God bless you. Keep your fences strong, keep your words stronger, and keep writing. There's always more road ahead.